Hello and welcome to Talking Heads. As America launches wave after wave of attacks against Afghanistan, the question many in India, in fact all over the world, are asking is, where are the voices of dissent within America? Well, at a time like this, we're fortunate enough to be joined in India by Professor Noam Chomsky, who some describe as one of the fiercest critics of American foreign policy. Professor Chomsky teaches linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. But it's really his writing and his lectures on international affairs, US foreign policy, and his constant expose of media manipulation that has won him a huge worldwide following. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us on Talking Heads. Let's begin with basics. America says that at the moment it's fighting a war against terrorism. I take it you have problems with all the terms of that definition.
Well, I'm quite happy to accept the definition of terrorism that the official definition that one finds in the U.S. Code and in Army manuals. In fact, for 20 years I've been writing about international terrorism, and I constantly use that definition. I think it's the right definition. The terrorism is defined officially as the, paraphrased, as the calculated use of violence, typically against civilians, for the purpose of intimidation and coercion to attain political, religious, ideological, or other ends. That's terrorism. By that, and that's a good definition. I agree with it. There are terrorist states. There are non-state terrorist actors, and in fact, the State Department has a list of terrorist states. Well, if we apply that definition, definition can't really be applied, and therefore it's not used. So there's that's the literal definition. The reason it can't be applied is two reasons. One is it's a virtual paraphrase of official U.S. doctrine, which is called Counter-Insurgency or low-intensity conflict. Mm-hmm. If you look at the same Army manuals, you find that's defined in approximately the same way. But that's official policy. The second reason why it can't be applied is that if you do apply it, it very quickly turns out that the United States is a leading terrorist state, exactly as you'd expect of the most powerful state in the world. I mean, it's a great analytic error to describe terrorism as a weapon of the weak. Like most weapons, it's primarily a weapon of the strong, and always has been.
Elaborate on that for us, Professor Chomsky, because that's also been the subject of one of your recent books, Rogue States, in which you forcefully argue that, in fact, America really emerges looking at the history of its foreign policy interventions as a rogue state, in contradiction to the other countries that America has classified as rogue, whether it's Iran or Afghanistan.
Well, I don't really think it's in contrast. In fact, I think it's generally the case that the most powerful states are the most brutal, and the ones that are able to act as rogue states. A rogue state is, after all, a state that acts as it chooses in defiance of international law and international opinion and other constraints. And who's able to do that? Well, the most powerful states. So if you go back to the 19th century, Britain was one of the major rogue states. In the latter part of the 20th century, the United States is supreme in these respects, and not surprisingly, it behaves like others. I mean, Andorra would be a rogue state if it could get away with it, but it can't, you know. And the record is extremely clear on that. I mean, we can just take a case that's totally uncontroversial, because we can appeal to the decisions of the highest international authorities, the International Court of Justice and the Security Council of the United Nations. So this is an uncontroversial case. The World Court has condemned one state for international terrorism, namely the United States. The victim, Nicaragua, this was not a minor act of terrorism. It left tens of thousands of people killed and country virtually destroyed, may not recover. Nicaragua took the case to the World Court. They won at the World Court. The United States dismissed the decision with total contempt immediately. The U.S. was ordered to desist from the terrorism and to pay reparations. It reacted by immediately escalating the war.
But some would argue that no country, least of all a superpower like America, would take an attack like the ones of September 11th lying down without any retaliation. So where do you think America has gone wrong in the manner in which it's retaliated?
Well, there are many. I mean, you could say the same about Nicaragua. Incidentally, Nicaragua is by no means the worst case. Far from it. I mention it because it's an uncontroversial case, given the decisions of the highest authorities. So how should Nicaragua have reacted when it was under terrorist attack that practically destroyed the country and killed tens of thousands of people? Well, you know, the way it did react is the way it's supposed to react. It couldn't get anywhere because it was confronting a rogue state, which happens to be a dominant rogue state. If the U.S. pursued that course, nobody would block it. There would be, in fact, in this particular case, it's kind of striking because the U.S. could have gotten a Security Council resolution. Not for very pretty reasons, but it could have. The reason is that the 5 states with veto power are all terrorist states, strong, powerful, and violent terrorist states. And for their own reasons, they would have supported the U.S. In order to gain U.S. support for their own terrorism. I mean, Britain follows the U.S. reflexively. France wouldn't raise any objections, and they have a terrible record themselves. Russia is delighted to have U.S. support for its massacres and atrocities in Chechnya. China would be quite happy, in fact is happy, to have U.S. support for its violent repression of Muslims in the western part of China. There wouldn't have been any veto. Right. But the U.S. didn't want a Security Council resolution because it wanted to act like a rogue state. It wanted to act without authorization. So there's a way to proceed. I mean, I wouldn't have approved of that Security Council resolution because of the reasons for which it would have been passed, but that would have been possible.
But would there have been another way, which is perhaps not the airstrikes, not the Security Council resolution, which, as you say, comes replete with its own hypocrisies? Is there another alternative that the U.S. could have pursued?
Yes, you do what you do when a crime takes place, and no matter whether it's a small crime or a huge crime. Like if it's a robbery in the streets or an attack on another country, a terrorist attack like Nicaragua, you try to find the perpetrators, you present evidence against them, and you try to bring them to justice. Actually, that's what Nicaragua did. It had no difficulty finding the perpetrators and finding evidence. Couldn't bring them to justice. The U.S. could do the same thing. It chose to do something different, namely not to attack the perpetrators. The people who are being killed in Afghanistan are not terrorists. That's the population of Afghanistan. There's a lot of concentration on what they call collateral damage, the people who get killed if a bomb goes in the wrong place. All right, that's bad, but the reason there's concentration on it is because it's very small. It's a trivial part of the atrocities. The main atrocities, which are well understood and have been known from the beginning, are imposing a conscious and purposeful imposition of mass starvation on huge numbers of people. It may be millions of people. Now, that was the initial decision instantly. These people are going to die of starvation, and already are not Taliban. They're not supporters of the Taliban. The Muslims are victims of the Taliban.
To those of us watching from India, the kind of views that you're voicing are completely invisible in the American mainstream media, just as invisible as they were during the Gulf War. Has there been any change in the way that mainstream American media networks or newspapers are reporting this war?
They're a little bit more open than they used to be in the past. So, for example, take during the Vietnam War. I mean, at that time, there wasn't a word of criticism permitted. Totally closed. The 1960s, it changed the society. It became a much more open and, in many ways, civilized society. And that affected the media, and they've become somewhat more open. I don't want to exaggerate, but in this particular case, for example, it's the first time in my memory, 50 years of activism, that there has been any opening to the media at all. Not to the national media, so not to the, in the U.S. sense, liberal media, meaning kind of social democratic, not National Public Radio, not the New York Times. But when you move out of that domain, there is some opening and a fair amount of discussion.
Why is that, you think? What do you think has changed?
Because people are, well, a number of things. For one thing, people are, contrary to the headlines, the population is frightened, angry, of course, perplexed, confused, concerned about the background, wants to hear about issues that have been swept under the rug and have never been discussed. When you move to the, say, the business press, like the Wall Street Journal, they've been, from immediately after September 11th, have been running pretty serious articles on the attitudes in the Muslim world towards U.S. foreign policy, recognizing that that's part of the background. It doesn't, it's not the terrorists, but it's part of the reservoir of at least tacit support on which they draw. Terrorists draw from some kind of basis of support, otherwise they wouldn't survive. The terrorist groups themselves are a different story, and nobody knows them better than the CIA. Right. Helped organize them. In fact, it nurtured them for 10 years while they were as a. It's not just the CIA, but the CIA, British intelligence, French intelligence, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, organized a huge mercenary army, and they went after the best killers they could find, who happened to be the most extreme radical Islamists that they could round up in North Africa and Saudi Arabia and so on. They armed them, they trained them, they nurtured them. They were carrying out, the point was to harass the Russians as much as possible. Mm-hmm. They didn't care about Afghanistan. In fact, they left it a wreck. These people were following their own agenda from the beginning. It wasn't a secret. I mean, they assassinated President Sadat of Egypt 20 years ago. The record of terrorism ever since. They were fine as long as their terrorist actions and hatreds and fanaticisms could be used for U.S. purposes. It just changed later. In fact, how little it changed is pretty astonishing. I mean, this attack on the World Trade Center, remember, is the second. There was another one in 1993.
That's right.
It almost worked. It came pretty close, and they had much bigger plans, blowing up the UN building, tunnels, FBI building. One of the people who's now in jail for that terrorist attack is an Egyptian cleric who was brought into the United States just 3 years before that over the objection of the Immigration and National Service by intervention of the CIA, because he was one of their people and they wanted him in. He was under indictment in Egypt for terrorism.
Right. But again, coming back to the point we were talking about earlier, these contradictions do exist. You say that they are finding greater voice in the American media, but
not in the media so much.
Not in the media.
A little bit in the media,
right.
But in the general population, yes.
Right.
And to some extent in the media.
Because what the rest of the world is watching, especially on major American television networks, is what has now become a familiar choreography of war reportage. You see planes taking off, you see State Department briefings, and so on, and that kind of questioning, the kind of contradictions you're pointing out still continue to be absent.
As in every country. I don't know of a historical exception. Do you know of a case of a country which was using violence, and its own national media were exposing that? It doesn't happen. The United States is not different from other states. I mean, I've actually spent a lot of time since September 11th. I've been doing almost nothing but either giving talks or having radio, television interviews around the world. And the differences are quite striking. So, for example, take, say, the Irish Sea. An interview on Irish national radio or television and British national radio and television are quite different in the assumptions that are made. And you can understand why. It depends who's been holding the lash for 500 years and who's been under the lash for 500 years. Right. It gives you a different picture of the world. And the same is true around the world. But a criticism of one's own state and its own violence is extremely rare, historically.
Well, it's actually a debate that we confronted here in India when a few years ago we fought a kind of a mini war with Pakistan, the Kargil war, as you know. And a lot of these same questions came up: national interest, media, the extent to which we could criticize our government for intelligence failure, for perhaps not acting swiftly enough.
How about criticizing the government for outright terrorism? So, for example, the major international human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have produced reams of material on Indian state terrorism in Kashmir and in fact elsewhere.
And these issues are reported in the mainstream media,
Very
perhaps
little.
not as much as they should be, but they
very
are.
little. You hear very little about India as a terrorist state and a sponsor of terrorism because it established terrorist paramilitary groups. Or for that matter, take India's support of the Northern Alliance. That's public. What's the Northern Alliance? That's a group of warlords who were in control of Afghanistan, in fact, in the early 1990s. And Human Rights Watch describes that as the worst period in Afghanistan's history. They killed about 50,000 people, were conducting mass rapes. In fact, they were so horrendous that the Taliban were actually welcomed when they came in and drove them out. So yes, India's like Russia, and now the United States is supporting a terrorist, that terrorist organization. That's by no means the only case. These are the topics that ought to be in the forefront of attention in every country.
Right.
No matter what country you are or who you are. I mean, in personal life too. You should be concerned with what you are doing. It's easy to condemn somebody else's crimes.
Right.
But first look in the mirror. You find a lot when you look there. In the case of right in front of our eyes, what we see is that the United States, Britain, India happen to be supporting massive atrocities against civilians right now. Huge atrocities. Not the collateral damage, not the bombing of a hospital, but just purposely notice, because they know all about it, imposing mass starvation, which is going to carry, the country was already on the verge of disaster. Even before the bombing, there was an estimate of maybe 5 or 6 million people kind of just on the edge of starvation, surviving on food aid. When the threat of bombing came, that became much worse. The aid agencies withdrew, the food was withdrawn, people fled, and so on. It became much worse. With the bombing, it became much more serious. In fact, even the New York Times estimated that the number of people facing starvation increased by about 50%, from 5 million to 7.5 million. That's 2.5 million people that they're adding to their expectation of starvation. It's worse than that. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations announced, it wasn't reported in the United States, but they announced that not only is there a humanitarian catastrophe impending because of the cutbacks, but also the bombing has disrupted the planting of about 80% of the crops, meaning there'll be an even worse famine next year. These are purposeful, conscious acts. They are acts of massive violence and terror. None of that justifies the atrocities of September 11th. They were an enormous atrocity too, but it happens that the 21st century is beginning with 2 huge atrocities, and we're involved in one of them.
Are you worried, Professor Chomsky, when you address audiences within America, or you travel all over the world and you give lectures and interviews, that to some extent you're preaching to the converted, that the sort of people who come and listen to you are the ones who already share those views, and those who are actually taking those policy decisions that you question aren't?
Well, I hope that's true, because the audiences are immense. Just before I came, I gave talks in the city where I live, which had an audience of about 2,000 or 3,000 people with overflows and so on.
Boston.
Yeah,
in
and
Boston.
it's easily, and over the internet, so many more. I was on, for the first time ever, on national cable television. That's the mass popular medium for a question and answer program with a live audience. Almost every question was serious. I wouldn't say they agreed with me, I wouldn't expect them to, but serious questions, thoughtful questions, the right questions, I thought, good interchange. If that's the converted, there's an awful lot of converted out there. And everyone else who's involved, as I am, finds the same thing.
So, in the context of your earlier writings, where you, to use your own phrase, you talked about a secular priesthood within the American intelligentsia that in a way builds public opinion or shapes public opinion.
Tries to.
Or tries to shape public opinion to legitimize.
But then there's a big difference between trying to and succeeding. It typically does not succeed. It doesn't happen to matter very much, because the country it's an elite-run system. Technically a democracy, but the public is mostly marginalized. So there is a narrow sector of decision making, but if you look for years, they've been very separate from the public. I mean, take the Vietnam War, huge issue. For about 30 years now, there have been regular, detailed polls on public attitudes towards the Vietnam War.
Right.
Consistently, about 2/3 to 70%, when asked what they think about the war, say, I'm quoting now, say, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. There's virtually no one in the elite intelligentsia who says that. This figure of 70% is astonishing because every one of those people made it up for themselves.
Right.
They didn't read it anywhere. They didn't hear it anywhere unless they're part of the activist movement. The most critical that you can be in the mainstream, this includes left intellectuals, is that the war was began, well, quote the most left-wing commentator in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis. The war began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969, after South Vietnam had been wiped out practically, it was clear that it was a mistake and was too costly to ourselves, and we got into a quagmire. Now that's the intelligentsia. The general population is totally different.
Do you see that happening again with this war, where the secular priesthood is trying to manufacture consent? Do you see that happening again?
Trying. In fact, we're told everything I've just said you'll almost never find in the mainstream discussion, including the respectable kind of left liberal press, liberal in the U.S. sense, kind of social democratic. So there, it's just a just war necessarily. The population is, I wouldn't say the population disagrees, they're just confused. For example, very little of the population can be aware of the fact that the target of the war is Afghan civilians. To know that, you have to find out what is being said by the aid agencies, by the Red Cross, by the World Food Program, by the Special Rapporteur for Food of the United Nations, by Mary Robinson. That you don't find in the press. I mean, so Mary Robinson, for example, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, her plea and her warning of a Rwanda-style massacre literally received 3 sentences in the entire U.S. press, 3 scattered sentences. How can anybody know?
Lastly, Professor Chomsky, as someone who's always, in a way, challenged institutions, are you worried about becoming somewhat of an institution yourself?
No, I don't think there's too much danger of that.
Because
first of all, I'm not unique by any means. There are many people who live the same kind of life I do, and have for many years, many of them before I got started, and younger ones. These are the things that dissidents do.
Well, you're being modest, because the New York Times, no less, has called you arguably one of the most important intellectuals alive.
Well, people often quote that sentence, but they don't quote the next sentence, which was, how can he say such terrible things about U.S. foreign policy? But it's the same everywhere. I mean, I don't know of any country where there isn't an articulate group of dissident critics who are marginalized naturally because they oppose power systems, often have a good deal of resonance, interaction with the general public, but who you won't find in the mainstream, certainly not in their own country, maybe somewhere else.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you.